In February 1818, a French woman by the name of Désirée Clary became Queen of Sweden and Norway, and all of the subsequent monarchs of Sweden since have descended from her. So just how did the daughter of a silk merchant from Marseille become queen here, and why would she spend years avoiding her position? To find all this out, let's go back to the beginning. Bernardine Eugénie Désirée Clary was born in the southern French port city of Marseille on the 8th of November 1777. Her father was François Clary, a descendant of an Irish political and religious emigrant who changed his surname from Clary to the more French-sounding Clary. François was a successful silk merchant, with Marseille having a long-standing trade in oriental goods such as silk. Her mother, Françoise Rousseau, was her father's second wife, and together the couple had 9 children, of which she was the youngest. Growing up, she went by Eugénie or Désirée, rather than her first name Bernardine. She was afforded a decent education at a convent during her primary school days. However, the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 saw wide-ranging attacks on the church and religious institutions across France. Thus, the convent she had been attending was closed down, and her education was cut short at the start of the 1790s. Following this, she was homeschooled, but the education she received here wasn't the best. In 1794, Désirée's father François sadly passed away. Not long after, as the revolution took a more radical turn in Paris, the family were under suspicion, as it was revealed that François had aristocratic pretensions, and had even tried to become ennobled in past years. With their position undermined, and the head of the household dead, Désirée and her siblings began looking to forge new alliances. They did so with the Bonapartes, a family of exiles from the island of Corsica, who had fled to the French mainland in the summer of 1793, as the Corsican nationalist movement brought it into conflict with the French revolutionary government. In 1794, Désirée's older sister Julie married Joseph Bonaparte. Through that arrangement, she would become Queen of Naples and then Queen of Spain in years to come. Désirée also entered a relationship around this time with Joseph's brother, Napoleon. He was a rising military officer, having played an important role in the siege of Toulon the previous autumn and winter as head of the artillery division there. Eventually, in the course of the spring of 1795, Désirée and Napoleon became engaged to one another. He even wrote a romantic novella concerning their relationship, which he entitled Clisson et Eugénie. But in the months that followed, he was posted to Paris on military duty, while Eugénie was living in the city of Genoa in northwestern Italy. While in Paris, Napoleon began a relationship with Josephine de Beauharnais, a French woman 6 years his senior, from the French colony of Martinique in the Caribbean. Infatuated with her, Napoleon broke off his relationship with Désirée. Désirée spent the next 2 years living in Rome with her sister Julie, whose husband Joseph Bonaparte had managed to acquire a position as a French diplomat to the papacy. In 1797, she headed to Paris, and it was there shortly afterwards that she met Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. He was a French general who had carved out a reputation as an accomplished military commander through victories in the French Revolutionary Wars against the Austrians in the Low Countries and then in southern Germany between 1794 and 1796. They were married in August 1798 in a secular ceremony. Their only child, a boy named Oscar, followed just over 10 months later. Désirée and Jean-Baptiste's marriage would prove to be a peculiar one. It was clearly one of convenience, and they certainly did not love each other. Over the years, they would spend extensive periods of time apart as he campaigned, or as she simply continued to spend time in Paris instead of joining him elsewhere. There were political elements to it as a union, with the marriage cementing an alliance between the Bernadottes and the Clarys at a time when Jean-Baptiste was a popular figure who could have made a move to acquire substantial power in Paris while Napoleon was absent during his ill-fated Egyptian campaign. In the end though, when he returned to France in the late autumn of 1799, Napoleon almost immediately launched a coup and claimed power as first consul of France that winter, a position which was elevated to become Emperor of the French in December 1804. The Bernadottes did well under Napoleonic rule. Jean-Baptiste was one of Napoleon's most accomplished generals, and was promoted as a Marshal of the Empire in 1804. Several of these marshals were later given senior aristocratic titles when Napoleon created a new French and European aristocracy as he conquered more and more of Europe. Jean-Baptiste was not granted a senior aristocratic title at this time, but he was made governor of the Hanseatic cities, the port cities of northern Germany centered on Lübeck, Hamburg and Bremen. He spent much of the mid to late 1800s here, while Désirée remained in Paris, where she was described as pretty, pleasing, and a skillful dancer, but fairly anonymous. Désirée and her husband might have continued to hold a position of considerable seniority within the new French aristocracy for some years to come, before fading away along with all of Napoleon's other allies in the mid-1810s, had it not been for the events of 1808 and 1809. In the summer of 1807, Napoleon concluded the Treaty of Tilsit with Tsar Alexander of Russia. Through this, peace was concluded between France and Russia, and they became allies. One of the terms of the agreement was that Russia would soon declare war on Sweden, one of France's few remaining enemies. Russia would be in a position to invade Sweden through Finland, which, in pre-modern times, was always a part of the Kingdom of Sweden. Thus, in the spring of 1808 the Russians invaded Finland, and then Alexander's forces traversed the frozen Gulf of Bothnia the following winter, descending on Stockholm and inflicting a punishing defeat on the Swedes. Finland was ceded to Russia at the end of the Finnish War in 1809. In the aftermath of this national humiliation, a coup followed in Sweden, one in which King Gustav Adolf IV was deposed and replaced with his uncle, who now became King Charles XIII. However, Charles was a man in his early 60s, suffering from senility, and also childless. Given this, the Swedish nobility knew that they would soon need to find another king. For a time they picked a Danish lord, Prince Christian August, as the potential heir, but when he died in 1810, the position became vacant again. Napoleon now stepped into the breach and pressured the Swedish Riksdag or Parliament to choose Désirée's husband Jean-Baptiste as the heir apparent to King Charles XIII. Although Bernadotte had no connections whatsoever to Sweden, at the time the Swedish estates believed that Napoleon would rule much of Europe for a long time to come, and that it was best to be on friendly terms with France. What better way to do so than by making a Frenchman their king? Thus, in the early autumn of 1810, Désirée's husband was made the heir apparent. When the elderly King Charles XIII died, Jean-Baptiste would become King of Sweden, and Désirée would become Queen Consort. Désirée, though, it seems, had no idea what becoming Queen Consort meant for her life. She believed that it would simply be a place that she had a title from, and was very upset when she was told that she was expected to leave Paris. She knew nothing about foreign countries, and only cared about France. After a lot of hesitation, Désirée left for Sweden in late 1810. Before leaving, some reluctant servants frightened her by saying Sweden was a country close to the North Pole and filled with polar bears. In Sweden she acquired the name Desideria on an official basis, though she continued to go by Désirée or Eugénie in private. Unfortunately for Désirée, she arrived during the winter. The extreme cold shocked her, and apparently she hated the snow so much that she cried. Despite this, while there she began to cultivate relationships with the aristocracy of the country she would be queen of one day, though about after a year in Sweden she headed back to Germany and then to France, making the excuse that she had health issues and other business to attend to. While there, Napoleon's affairs would threaten to scupper her and Jean-Baptiste's ascent as rulers of Sweden. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon's alliance with Russia came to a crashing end when he invaded Russia. Over the next several months, his armies advanced eastwards and occupied Moscow. But there was no victory. Tsar Alexander refused to enter peace negotiations, and eventually Napoleon's army had to retreat out of Russia back to Poland and Lithuania as disease and starvation gripped his forces. In the year that followed, his continental empire began to collapse as a new European alliance of Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, and their allies formed. Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the first time in April 1814, and even his daring return to power in the spring of 1815 eventually ended in defeat at Waterloo, and then permanent exile to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic thereafter. What is remarkable about Désirée and Jean-Baptiste is that they alone amongst the close allies of Napoleon managed to maintain their positions. Napoleon's brother Joseph, for instance, who had been made King of Spain in 1808, spent much of his later life in exile in the United States. Bonaparte's close friend Joachim Murat, who had been made King of Naples, was executed by firing squad in 1815 after Napoleon's empire collapsed. But Bernadotte maintained his position as heir presumptive to the throne of Sweden, and incredibly, when King Charles XIII died in the first weeks of 1818, Bernadotte succeeded as King Charles XIV John. With this, Désirée became Queen Desideria of Sweden. Désirée, though, did not take up her position as head of the royal court in Sweden in 1818. Instead, she spent the next half a decade in Paris, making a number of excuses for not heading to Stockholm. Her interest in staying in France was primarily owing to an infatuation with the Duke of Richelieu, a senior aristocrat at the court of King Louis XVIII in Paris. Eventually, in 1823, after her son Oscar had visited Western and Central Europe in search of a potential wife, she returned to Sweden with him. This was meant to be a quick visit, but as it turned out, Désirée would remain in Sweden for the rest of her life. A few days after her arrival, the royal court and the government were presented to her. Many at court suggested that they now begin preparations for her coronation, but this was delayed owing to concerns about how the coronation ceremony should be celebrated, as Sweden was a staunchly Lutheran Protestant nation, and Désirée refused to convert from Roman Catholicism. It would be another 6 years, until the 21st of August 1829 in Stockholm, that she was finally crowned. Interestingly, Désirée was the first commoner queen of Sweden since Karin Mansdotter in 1568. Her years as queen consort were unusual for their informality. She displayed zero interest in abiding by the ceremonies and rules of the royal court, and spoke openly to people even during formal events. She expressed this dislike in many letters to her sister Julie, with whom she remained close to for her whole life. In one letter, she stated the following: "How boring courts can be when you are not born within them. The ladies who attend to me are not very funny, and I am forced to restrict myself physically and morally. I can never adjust myself to the strict etiquette, which must always be observed at court. When you live surrounded by a court, and are forced to express your feelings in the form of polite phrases which are demanded at court, the difficulties are so great that you would rather not." Her antipathy towards court etiquette irked many, but she was liked for the fact that she showed no interest in politics and didn't question her husband's decision-making. Over the years, her lack of etiquette became more accepted, though the nobility privately ridiculed her past as a merchant's daughter and Republican, and the fact that she never even learned to speak the Swedish language. Over time, she withdrew increasingly from court events and displayed a desire to return to Paris, but Jean-Baptiste forbade it. As a result, she would continue to live in Stockholm even beyond her husband's death in the spring of 1844, and the accession of their son, King Oscar I. With her husband's death and her son's accession, Désirée became the Queen Mother of Sweden. She would spend the next 16 years as such, living long enough to see her grandson on the throne as King Charles XV. In her later years, she developed a reputation for her growing eccentricity, keeping peculiar hours for the time, often staying awake at night until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, before retiring and sleeping until lunchtime the following day. Sometimes, she would travel around the streets of Stockholm in her carriage late at night. On one occasion in May 1853, she prepared to return to her beloved Paris. Her grandson Prince Oscar, who later became king, was to escort her to her ship, and everything was ready. Yet, Désirée had become afraid of travelling by sea, and couldn't bring herself to leave. She eventually died on the 17th of December 1860, after an evening at the opera in the Swedish capital. Désirée was 83 years of age by then, having lived a long life by the standards of the time. All the kings of Sweden since have been descended from her, and the present monarch, King Gustav VI Adolf, is her great-great-great-grandson. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Désirée Clary, the Queen of Sweden. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.